Hello, 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 everyone. Welcome to Dismantling Justice, the podcast of Brooklyn Community Bail Fund. You can learn more about our work by visiting us at brooklynbailfund.org. I'm Carl Hammond Lipscomb, BCBF's Director of Advocacy and Policy, and I'm here with Saleh Israel, our Director of Special Initiatives and the producer of this podcast. So there's a lot going on in the headlines, particularly here in New York State, as well as nationally. So today we don't have a special guest, it's just family. And Saleh and I are gonna do a rundown of some of the pressing issues facing our communities and offer BCBF's perspective. So we're gonna take a little bit of a Breakfast Club style with this podcast and, just dig into the issues. Ready, Saleh?
I'm ready.
Great. All right, so first, the first headline that I have here is that the Halt Solitary Confinement Act passed. The Halt Solitary Confinement Act ended the most harmful uses of isolation and solitary confinement that were in practice throughout New York State. Under our previous law, incarcerated people in the state could be held in complete isolation for up to 23 hours a day. Our practices around solitary confinement, this has been going on for decades, but it really came to the forefront after Kalief Browder, who was in solitary confinement for years, was released, after the DA dropped his case because they didn't have evidence. So his case ended up being dismissed, and he just really solitary confinement really destroyed him. It caused very severe mental health challenges, and he ended up committing suicide. And solitary confinement has been shown to cause hallucinations, panic attacks, paranoia, difficulties with thinking and memory. This bill limits the use of confinement to 15 days. It implements alternative rehabilitative measures. It expands the definition of segregated confinement, and it eliminates the use of segregated confinement for vulnerable populations. And additionally, this bill establishes guidelines for humane conditions in solitary confinement. It mandates reporting, it adds due process, and it prohibits placement in solitary confinement prior to a disciplinary hearing, and by allowing access to counsel. So, Saleh, just to bring you into this, and I apologize for the background listeners if you're hearing this.
This is the first time I've ever heard it this loud in here.
I know, that's so funny, but I think we were louder than the voice behind us. So anyway, what do you think of this bill? And what do you think the impact of this bill will be on people that are currently incarcerated and that would be, under regular circumstances, unfortunately subjected to solitary confinement, which, we know that, people who are subjected to it were subjected to it at the whim of correction officers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, very much like what we have with regular policing. The things that get you into solitary confinement are usually based on nothing more than a report from a corrections officer. And then even when you are going through the process, solitary confinement is initiated the moment you are accused of something. They come and pack you up and throw you in a solitary confinement. And it can take up to 30 days just to get, the matter resolved, to find out even if you were guilty or if you had done what you've been accused of doing. So just to correlate that with pretrial detention and this kind of pretrial detention inside of, the prison systems in New York State. But I'll say, oftentimes, even when we think about that 1 hour of what they call recreation, we often think of somebody walking around a big yard by themselves. That 1 hour is also often in a cage that's kind of very close to other people that are in cages. And it's like a 4x4 cage. So it really does feel like 24-hour lockdown for all intents and purposes. It's not like that 1 hour was even this free range, go outside in the wilderness and just walk around for an hour like you see in the movies. It's not like that. And I think that's what largely contributes to this question of the psychological and emotional effects of confinement, that it really is, for all intents and purposes, 24-hour confinement. And, in terms of what this bill does, it sounds great on paper. I'm a cynic and a skeptic when it comes to what it means to actually have laws passed and how they're implemented inside institutions that don't really have third party autonomous objective watchdogs. I remember when I was I was in prison. For those who don't know, I did 20 years in prison in New York State. Bounced around to a lot of prisons while I was there, and once a year, the Corrections Association comes to the prisons, and for that week, it's like everyone that works there is on their best behavior. We're like everyone that is a porter or has any type of job that involves cleaning, they made to clean 24/7 before they get there, and then when they leave, it's back to you don't get supplies. No, cleaning supplies is like what they call a soap ball in one bucket to clean the entire big old room. So I mean, I know what it's like to be in those situations, to have what looks like some hope and change coming, and then it looks like it's there, and then when nobody's watching, it becomes something else. So I'm hoping that those who are going to be responsible for ensuring that this bill has its intended impact and effect, I'm hoping that they are actually given the authority to make sure that it has its impact and effect. And just to be clear, they have something called, we always talk about solitary confinement, but they have something called long-term keep lock that this does not affect, where people literally left in their cells, which is unaccompanied, meaning is where everybody generally is at, but they can't come out. And it's not considered solitary confinement because they can see people walking by, but they're still locked in that cell for 23 hours a day. And they may get an extra shower. You might get showered 3 times a week instead of 1 time a week in solitary confinement. So this question of confinement and how far this bill goes, I think is a great start. But I think we really need to take a very serious look at what it means to discipline people when they're already in prison. And the policies that we utilize to affect that discipline usually are these kind of like corporal punishment type things. I know people that are given like you get told to do something, you're given 7 days work detail, right? And that means like go scrub something for 7 days. It's very, very archaic in that sense.
Yeah, and when we say archaic, we mean like pre-Civil War slavery archaic.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
That is like
barbaric. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. All right. So the next headline, New York, for those, I'm sure like all of our listeners know this, but New York has decriminalized marijuana use. There are a lot of happy people out there now. New Yorkers are now allowed to possess up to 3 ounces of cannabis for recreational use, or 24 grams of concentrated cannabis. People 21 and older are allowed to use, smoke, ingest, consume. They can give it to others. At home, people can store up to 5 pounds of cannabis, but as long as they take reasonable steps to make sure it's stored in a secure place. People are allowed to smoke in public, wherever smoking tobacco is legal. The law also allows dispensary licenses, so people can now set up effectively weed stores, but localities can opt out of allowing dispensary licenses by the end of this year. And I think importantly, officers can no longer stop and arrest you for marijuana possession, although operating a motor vehicle under the influence is still illegal. And everyone convicted for marijuana use or possession, anyone that has that conviction on their records will have their records expunged. So that offense will no longer be on the record, which, I think this is great news, all of it. Especially the expungement part for me. When I was a public defender, I'd say like a good third of my clients, which I'm like over 200 clients were arrested for something to do with marijuana. It was always a questionable arrest to begin with. The complaints they literally said the same thing, like cut and pasted. So-and-so was walking down the street, and as an officer approached, he saw the person throw it on the ground. And then the officer smelled the person, and based on their knowledge and experience, they arrested them for possessing marijuana, even though they didn't find it on them. And so, this is another long-fought victory. But in some ways, it was low-hanging fruit. The public sentiment around marijuana use has changed. And it changed a long time ago, so we're kind of late to the party. But I guess my question here, Sally, is that I've thought about is, do you think this sets us on track to decriminalizing other offenses?
Yeah, I want to say, a lot of studies have been done about marijuana and what the impact and the side effects of marijuana is. It's always been a question about why is it treated like other drugs. I think this question of decriminalization, I think is going to be, it's going to take a lot more. I don't think it's like the gateway to decriminalizing other types of drugs, unfortunately. But I will say, this question of people getting their records expunged. I don't know if anyone knows this, but if you got one of those marijuana charges, you couldn't even get Pell in certain places. You couldn't get. They had TAP in New York. You couldn't get TAP. Like that means you couldn't get education. If you were a 17-year-old kid that got arrested and charged as an adult for marijuana, then you were done. It was like you would be fighting. There were certain jobs you couldn't get, certain licenses you couldn't hold. So this opens up, a world of opportunities for people who had all kinds of bars put on them. I mean, it is like for a lot of people, way too little, way too late. And I think you just hit on that. This question of, I always use it as an example. When that like you said, that thing where I'm walking by, they say I threw something. As long as they find it, it's mine. And I'm charged and I'm indicted. But if we have a video of a cop with somebody's foot on the neck, we have to do a lot more investigation, right? It's like, go figure, right? Like we have this thing where him simply saying he saw is enough to get me indicted and arrested and then have this stain on me forever. But the world sees it's like, no, we still have to look at this before we actually bring an indictment. Right. I mean, just to see how much changing this which seems now like a small thing, it was never a small thing, right? This has been a gateway to all kinds of people being wrapped up into the system for very long periods of time and mostly their entire lives.
Yep.
So I think it's a great thing. I'm not optimistic that it means they'll decriminalize other drugs, but I do think this question of where we're at marijuana may readjust the bar of how we treat other drugs. I think we are at a phase where we're looking at addiction much differently in this country for lots of reasons. I think fentanyl, heroin is one of the big ones. And, there's no question that fentanyl, heroin are much more dangerous than something like cocaine. And I'm not minimizing any type of impact of any drug, but I think because we have this, this epidemic here of heroin use, I think we're recalibrating everything to say if we're going to treat them like addicts because they're at certain neighborhoods in certain areas, we have to rethink what addiction is. Yep. And I think the first step of that was saying marijuana is a different thing than the type of addiction we've been talking about. Mm-hmm. I think that's what this is evidence of.
Yeah. Yep. And so a couple of other things. So this legislative session in New York, we also saw the Walking While Trans law repealed. The Walking While Trans law was basically a law that, enabled the police to arrest, people for loitering for the purpose of prostitution, and it was often used to target trans people that would be hanging out outside because there was nowhere safe for them to hang out inside, and police would drive by and arrest them and accuse them of prostitution. Also, the Protect Our Courts Act passed, and that prohibits ICE arrests in or near courthouses. In addition, we had Jose A. Saldana on a couple of weeks ago talking about parole justice, talking about elder parole, and fair and timely parole, both of which would allow meaningful parole reviews for people that are, in terms of fair and timely parole, it's parole reviews for people who are already parole eligible. Elder parole would allow parole release for people 55 and older who have already served 15 years or more. And Jose A. Saldana, he was hopeful that those, that those bills would be passed. But I say all this to say, and I think that's going to be the title of this episode, is Revolution in the Air. Katie Schaefer talked to us about the Justice Roadmap a few weeks ago, and it's made a lot of headway in recent years with all of these bills being passed. And we can argue about why that is. It could be because Democrats have a supermajority in the legislature. It could be because Andrew Cuomo needs a distraction, and this time it's benefiting our folks rather than hurting us. I'll say this, in 2019 felt similar. We had bail reform pass, as did the Close Rikers bill here in the city. But since 2019, we've actually seen bail reform rolled back significantly and quickly, like within 3 months of bail reform taking effect, before we even saw the impact, it was rolled back. And now, this week, the Center for Court Innovation issued a report showing the judges issued higher amounts of bail and set bail more often last summer when we were in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and no one, no one could afford bail at all, and families were struggling the most. Judges set bail more often then. And, to a certain degree, a lot of people who may have had bail set free set are free, and we're happy about that. On the other hand, cash bail wasn't eliminated completely, and we're now seeing judges misapplying the bail reform or overcompensating for not being able to set bail in certain cases. And what I think this points to is that, these like incremental policy reforms can only get us so far, even though they are important for the sake of freeing people right now. And so, my question here, Sally, is what can we do to make sure that we don't let policymakers, prosecutors, judges, etc., off the hook once these policies are implemented? How important is it that we continue to organize and advocate?
I think first is this question of what does it look like for them to be implemented. I just don't, I am normally, like I said, normally when I see these, I think bail reform was a great one. It comes down and you have to wait the storm, right? You mentioned parole. I know people that make the parole board and then their date is taken back because somebody wrote and said, I don't want this person out. After they were already given their date until they were going to go home this day, and the parole board stays that date and then rescinds it. So, from those experiences, and similarly, I mean, again, that parole reform package, it wasn't enough, but it passed and then it got rolled back. So, when we talk about stuff like in the halt in the solitary confinement, all right, I'm waiting. What is it? Are we going to hear from the corrections union, which they always do? Like, what's coming? And I just don't have the, until we actually see on the ground actual implementation that benefits the people who need protection when the state is like going too far, then I don't necessarily believe it's going to happen until it happens. I know it's a very cynical way to live your life, but in this case, it's someone that's been in that position and heard all kinds of wild stories about things that were coming to help us that never came, and people never came. And largely, I mean, you look at COVID's happening right now. People in prison haven't had visits in New York State for over a year. Who's going to? We don't know what's happening there, right? We don't understand. No one's there to watch and see what's happening. And there's a reason why now they can use why nobody's there. And I think on the optimistic side, a lot of the bills that you mentioned being passed say that policing has to look different. Like each, decriminalize marijuana, policing has to look different. 99% of the reason I smell something. You don't smell cocaine, you don't smell heroin. I smell marijuana. Pull you over, stop you, right? Yeah. Walking while trans, right? You look like you could be doing something wrong. Just not because you are. I think because the way you look. And I can no longer stop you now, which initiates a whole lot of, well, when I stopped you, you swung your hand, that's assault on a cop. I mean, you were loyal. Look at me. You always saw these little minor things with all these other charges that were tied into them. And the gateway was always the reason why they're claiming that they stopped you in the first place. So I think from that perspective, I think these little incremental laws that we're seeing are directly related to what it means to be policed in New York State. Yeah. And, we're wiping away all the probable cause questions that allow people to be, unjustly detained and unjustly processed into the system. And I think is much more we can do of this is, I think, that we can see change through these incremental, like, I think it was Charles Hurston III, that social engineering, legal incrementalism. I mean, it seems like that's where we're at, right? It feels like what we're doing right now is we have this kind of like, through legislators, we're having this kind of like these small pieces and pockets that when you put the puzzle together, it does look like that roadmap to say, we can't have this unless we attack this, unless we attack that. And they look small, but they're adding up. And what that means is, again, the amount of reasons why you can have engagement with the police in New York State, in particular New York City, are vanishing, right? Yeah. What's going to be the new reason why they say we stopped you?
Yeah, they're definitely going to have a reason. And, of course, they've come out against all of these bills. But, like you said, like it's an uphill battle, but clearly, we're climbing that hill and, we're going to reach the top at some point, hopefully soon. I think this is a good place for us to end. Thank you again, listeners, for joining us. Don't forget to visit us online at brooklynbailfund.org. Follow us on all of the socials. And until next time, and until we're all free, peace out.